I'm Claire Whitmore, 34 years old, and last month I sat in a lawyer's office while my brother was handed everything my father built, and I was left with a house that should have been condemned years ago. The tension in that room was so sharp you could hear it breathe. My brother smiled like a man accepting a crown, while my thumb pressed into the brass key I'd just been given, until the metal bit into my skin. I wanted to ask why to demand an answer that might make sense, but instead I just stared at the will, its neat black letters dividing an entire lifetime of effort. That day I thought my father had overlooked me one last time. I was wrong. Before I go any further, tell me where you're listening from in the comments and hit that like and subscribe button if you've ever been underestimated by your own family. I grew up in Asheville, North Carolina, in a house that smelled of old paper wood polish and ambition. My father, Richard Whitmore, was a man who believed in rules the way some people believe in prayer. A retired Army major, he turned his discipline into a business, a small printing company that grew into one of the largest in the region. He used to say that order was love in disguise, though love was something he rarely said out loud. My mother, Evelyn, balanced his iron edges with warmth and laughter. She kept peace in a household that often felt like a competition, though none of us ever said it that way. Aaron, my brother, was the kind of person who filled every room he walked into. He had charm, quick answers, and an easy confidence that drew people in. Dad saw himself in him, called him future CEO, before Aaron could even drive. Me, I was quieter. I liked drawing floor plans and rearranging furniture, small details that made things feel whole. Dad used to pat my head absently and say, "Your brother's got the fire, kiddo. You've got the calm." I didn't know back then that calm can be mistaken for insignificance. When Mom died, something in our family broke that couldn't be fixed. Aaron moved to Charlotte chasing business deals and women who smiled for the camera. I stayed home. Someone had to help Dad, and if I'm honest, I didn't know how to leave. He grew older, softer in the body, but not in spirit. His heart began to fail, and when the doctor said he needed round-the-clock care, I became his nurse, his cook, his quiet company. Ruth Adams, the hospice nurse, came every morning at 9, bringing with her a sense of calm that filled the silence. I couldn't. She once told me, "Your father talks about you when he thinks you're asleep." I wanted to believe her, though his words never showed it. There were nights when I'd sit in the armchair beside his bed, the clock ticking steady, his oxygen machine humming low. He would stir and ask for water, and I would hold the glass to his lips, careful not to spill. He never thanked me, not in words, but there were moments, brief, almost invisible, when he would rest his hand on mine before drifting off again. It was enough. I thought that was love in his language. When he died, the house fell silent in a way I can't describe. The smell of antiseptic lingered in the air, mixed with the faint trace of his aftershave. Aaron arrived late to the funeral, wearing a charcoal suit and sunglasses dark enough to hide any emotion. He shook hands with business partners, spoke of Dad's legacy, and barely looked my way. People came to me with kind eyes and soft voices, offering condolences I couldn't absorb. It was all a blur of black coats and damp grass. 3 weeks later, the lawyer called. I remember the weather that day, heavy clouds, air thick with rain. The office smelled like leather and old furniture polish. Aaron sat across from me, confident as ever, his cufflinks gleaming under the fluorescent light. Mr. Morton adjusted his glasses and began to read the will, his voice steady, rehearsed. To my son, Aaron Whitmore, I leave Whitmore Printing Solutions, including all its assets and accounts. Aaron exhaled, a satisfied hum slipping from his throat. Then came my turn. To my daughter, Claire Whitmore, I leave the family farmhouse at 214 Maple Road, including all belongings within. The silence that followed was louder than any insult. Aaron chuckled under his breath, then louder, pretending it was a joke. "Guess you get the fixer-upper, sis," he said. The cousins shifted uncomfortably in their seats. I wanted to disappear. There was no hidden clause, no explanation, just a signature that confirmed it all. Dad's legacy was his business, and Aaron was now the heir. I was the caretaker who got the ruins. I left without looking back. Aaron caught up with me in the hallway, that same grin still plastered on his face. "Don't take it too hard," he said lightly. "Next time, maybe try being the investor instead of the nurse." I walked away before my voice could betray me. Outside, the sun broke through the clouds, blinding for a moment. In my hand, the brass key felt heavier than it should have. I didn't understand why I couldn't let it go. That night, I drove out to the farmhouse alone. The porch light was broken, the windows fogged with age. When I stepped inside, the air was thick with dust and silence. I ran my hand along the wall and felt the ridges of old wallpaper beneath my fingertips. Every corner carried a memory: my mother's laughter, my father's low voice, the echo of a life that used to feel steady. I set my bag down on the counter and turned on the faucet. The water sputtered brown for a few seconds before running clear. I stood there watching it, my reflection trembling on the surface. It wasn't much, but it was mine. And even as the floorboards groaned beneath my feet, a strange thought crossed my mind. Maybe Dad hadn't left me with nothing. Maybe he'd left me with something I just hadn't found yet. The farmhouse had always seemed smaller when I was a kid, but standing in it now with the weight of silence pressing in from every direction, it felt enormous. The floors groaned with each step I took, and the air smelled faintly of pipe tobacco and dust. Light slipped through the cracks in the curtains, falling in narrow stripes across the worn wooden floor. I left my bag by the front door and walked toward the old study, the room my father had once called Command Central. The desk still sat under the window, polished to a soft shine, a few of his papers stacked neatly on top. I touched the chair, half expecting to hear his voice giving quiet instructions, or the low rumble of the printer from years ago. Instead, there was only the faint hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen and the echo of my own breath. That first night I couldn't sleep. I sat on the sofa wrapped in one of Mom's old quilts, staring at the ceiling and listening to rain against the windows. Every board and pipe seemed to complain, as if the house itself hadn't expected to be lived in again. I thought about Aaron, the way his laughter had filled the lawyer's office when the will was read, how easily he'd accepted what he thought he deserved. The memory settled like a stone in my chest. I wanted to understand why my father had done it, why the man who taught me that precision was respect had left me what everyone else considered worthless. Morning brought a thin light through the kitchen window and the smell of wet earth. I made coffee in Dad's old percolator, the one he'd used since I was a teenager. The machine sputtered and hissed, but the sound was strangely comforting. I sat at the small table by the window, sipping from a chipped mug, watching the fields beyond the property stretch into fog. It was the same view my father had looked at every morning before heading to work. I tried to imagine what he saw in it, what kind of peace he found here that I never noticed before. By mid-morning, Ruth stopped by. She'd been my father's caretaker in those final months, and I hadn't seen her since the funeral. She looked tired but warm, her silver hair pulled into a bun, her eyes soft behind thick glasses. She carried a paper bag with fresh muffins and a thermos of coffee. "You shouldn't be here alone," she said, setting everything down on the counter. "This house can feel heavy." I smiled faintly, though I wasn't sure if she meant heavy with memories or just heavy with problems waiting to be fixed. We talked for a while, mostly about Dad, the things he used to say, the small routines that had filled his days. "He was proud of you, Claire," she said at one point, her voice quiet but certain. "He might not have said it the way you wanted, but he showed it." I didn't know how to answer. Pride wasn't something my father handed out easily, not even to Aaron. Still, hearing it from her made something inside me ease just a little. After she left, I spent the afternoon cleaning. Dust clung to everything, the shelves, the banister, even the picture frames lining the hallway. There was one photo that caught my eye, Aaron at 10, holding a Little League trophy, Dad's arm around his shoulders. I was in the background, half out of the frame, watching them. I wiped the glass clean, though I couldn't say why. Maybe it was habit, or maybe I just needed to see things clearly again. As I worked, I thought back to those months before Dad passed. Aaron had visited only twice. He'd walk in wearing cologne that filled the whole room, hand Dad a bottle of his favorite bourbon, then talk about stock prices and company expansion. Dad would listen, nodding with polite interest, but his eyes would always drift toward the window to the trees he'd planted decades ago. The last time Aaron came, I overheard him in the hallway whispering into his phone, calling the business his future. He never once called it ours. When Dad's health declined, I stopped taking design clients. I spent my days organizing his medication, managing his bills, and keeping the machines running. Ruth helped with the harder moments, the nights when he struggled to breathe, or the mornings when his memory blurred. There was one morning right before sunrise when he'd asked me to open the windows. The air had been cool, the kind that smelled of rain and soil. He looked at me for a long time and said, "You notice the small things, Claire. That's your strength. Don't let anyone take that from you." He fell asleep shortly after, and 2 days later he was gone. Those words lingered as I swept the floor and opened the windows again, letting in fresh air. The smell of the rain carried through the rooms, stirring the dust. I thought about the life Dad built the company, the reputation, the house. He'd done it all with precision, and yet somehow this quiet place was what he'd chosen for me. I started to wonder if it was less of a rejection and more of a challenge. Maybe he believed I'd find something here that Aaron never could. That evening, I sat on the porch with a notebook listing repairs that needed to be made, the leaky roof, the broken steps, the wiring that probably hadn't been touched in 20 years. The list grew longer with every page, but I didn't stop. Somewhere in the middle, I wrote, "Don't give up." It wasn't something I planned to write. The words just came out steady as breathing. As the sky turned orange, I watched the road that led to town. No cars passed, no sound but the wind moving through the trees. I realized how far away everything felt Aaron's city life, the noise of success, the weight of expectations. Here it was just me and the echoes of the past. I didn't know what came next, but I knew I wasn't ready to leave. Later that night, I found myself drawn back to the study. The desk looked untouched, but something about it felt different, as if the air around it held a secret. I ran my fingers along the wood, feeling the small imperfections, scratches, dents, grooves where pens had pressed too hard. Then when I tried to move the desk to sweep behind it, I heard a hollow sound against the wall. I froze, tapping once, then again. The second tap was solid, the first wasn't. My pulse quickened. I crouched down and pressed my palm flat against the baseboard. The paint there didn't quite match. I fetched a screwdriver from the toolbox by the door and gently pried at the edge. A small piece of wood popped free, revealing a metal panel beneath it, a keypad. I stared, unsure what to think. There was only one code that came to mind. I entered my mother's birthday hands, shaking. For a second, nothing happened. Then a soft click echoed in the quiet room, and the panel swung open. Inside was a fireproof safe, no larger than a shoebox. A folded envelope was taped to the front with my name written in my father's handwriting. My throat tightened. I tore the tape loose and unfolded the note. "If you're reading this, you found what I needed you to find. This was never about money, Claire." That was all it said. Beneath the note was a small brass key labeled First National Bank Box, 212. I sat there for a long time, staring at the safe, the key, and the note. The air felt different now, lighter, almost charged. My father hadn't left me a ruin. He'd left me a trail. When I finally stood, the farmhouse seemed to hum with a quiet purpose I hadn't felt before. I placed the key in my pocket, turned off the light, and stepped out onto the porch. The wind rustled through the oak trees, and for the first time since his funeral, I thought I heard my father's voice, faint, steady, reminding me to pay attention to the details. The next morning, I would find out exactly what he'd been trying to show me. The night after finding the safe, I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that small brass key and the note taped to the front of the box. The handwriting was unmistakable, clean, sharp, deliberate, just like my father's. I kept hearing the sound of that latch clicking open, the whisper of metal against wood, as if the house itself had exhaled a secret it had been holding for years. By morning, I decided there was no use waiting. I was going to find out what he'd left behind. The drive into town took less than 20 minutes, but every mile felt longer. The weather was mild, a soft spring morning with sunlight flickering through the trees. The brass key sat heavy in my pocket, and I kept reaching for it as if it might disappear. When I pulled up to First National Bank, the building looked older than I remembered. Tall marble columns, polished glass doors, and a gold-lettered sign that hadn't changed since I was a kid. My father had brought me here once when I was 12 to open my first savings account. He'd made me sign the paperwork myself and said, "You earn respect by earning trust." I hadn't thought about that moment in years. Inside, the air was cool and smelled faintly of coffee and paper. A woman at the front desk looked up from her computer and smiled. Her nameplate read, "Diane Chen, branch manager." She stood and walked over with practiced calm. "Can I help you today?" she asked. I placed the key on the counter. "I believe this belongs to one of your safety boxes," I said. She took it, carefully examined the small tag, and her expression softened. "Whitmore," she said quietly, glancing up at me. I thought I recognized the name. "Your father was one of our regulars. Always came in on Fridays, same time, same coffee cup." She led me through a secured hallway lined with framed photographs of the bank's early days. The walls were pale gray, the floor echoing softly under our steps. "He was particular about how things were handled," she said, half smiling. "Never rushed, never missed a detail." I nodded. That sounded exactly like him. She stopped in front of a steel door with a keypad, entered a code, and motioned for me to step inside. The vault was quiet, humming faintly from the air control system. Rows of small metal boxes lined the walls, each one identical except for the numbers engraved on the front. Box 212 was near the middle row. Diane unlocked it with a master key, then stepped aside so I could use mine. The lock turned easily, a smooth click that echoed in the still air. "Take all the time you need," she said before leaving me alone. Inside the narrow booth, I slid the metal drawer free and placed it on the counter. My hands trembled slightly as I lifted the lid. The contents were neatly arranged, stacks of sealed envelopes, a few folders, and a small black flash drive wrapped in tissue paper. The first folder was labeled Investments, 2003-2022. I flipped it open, scanning through documents filled with numbers, company names, and stock certificates. My father had been meticulous. Each page had his signature in blue ink, his notes written in the margins. Near the bottom was an envelope with my name. I hesitated before opening it. The paper was thick, the handwriting steady and familiar. "Claire," it began. "If you're reading this, you passed the test I could never give your brother. Aaron measures worth by applause. You've always measured it by effort. I built the company for him to run, but I built this for you to understand. Everything in this box is yours. Use it wisely, quietly, and never let arrogance touch it. You were my balance. Make me proud." The rest of the words blurred as I kept reading numbers, account details, property deeds, all totaling just over $3 million. My breath caught. For a long time I just stared at the papers, unable to process the scale of it. He hadn't abandoned me. He'd trusted me. He'd wanted to see if I could find it on my own. I folded the letter carefully and held it against my chest. The cool metal of the vault pressed against my back, grounding me in the moment. When I left the bank, the sunlight felt different, sharper, almost gold. I sat in my car for a while, hands resting on the steering wheel. There was no rush of triumph, no wild disbelief, only a quiet sense of relief that filled every corner of my chest. I thought of my father's words about effort and balance, about arrogance. For the first time in years, I felt seen. That afternoon, I drove straight to Mr. Morton's office. The same oak door, the same brass nameplate. He looked surprised when I walked in, clutching the folder. "Claire," he said, rising from his chair. "I wasn't expecting you." I set the documents on his desk. "I need to talk to you," I said. "And I need Aaron to be there." He frowned slightly. "Is this about the estate?" I met his eyes. "It's about closure." He agreed to arrange a meeting later that week. I spent the next few days at the farmhouse sorting through the documents, reading every letter and instruction my father had left. The weight of his silence over the years made more sense now. He'd wanted to teach something neither Aaron nor I could learn through words alone. The farmhouse that everyone pitied me for wasn't punishment. It was preparation. Ruth stopped by again on Thursday, bringing a basket of groceries and that steady calm she always carried. I told her in small pieces what I'd discovered. She didn't look surprised. "He knew you'd find it," she said softly. "That's why he left it there. He wanted to see what you'd do when you thought you had nothing." She squeezed my hand, and for a moment, I couldn't speak. That night I went out to the porch. The sky was clear stars scattered like salt over black velvet. I sat on the steps and listened to the wind moving through the trees. My father's voice echoed in memory. "You notice the small things. That's your strength." He'd known exactly who I was, even when I didn't think he saw me. When the day of the meeting came, I woke early. The farmhouse was quiet, the morning light spilling through the windows. I laid out the documents on the kitchen table one more time, the trust papers, the letters, the statement confirming the value of the account. Then I folded them neatly into a manila folder and slipped it into my bag. On the drive into town, the same stretch of road I'd taken to the bank looked different now. The trees seemed taller, the sky wider. By the time I parked in front of the law office, my nerves had settled into a steady calm. I knew what I had to do. When Aaron arrived, he was his usual self, late confident phone in hand. He greeted Mr. Morton with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. So he said, glancing at me, finally decided to sell that old farmhouse. I didn't answer. Mr. Morton cleared his throat and gestured for us to sit. The room was the same one where we'd heard the will. The air felt heavier now, charged with something I couldn't name. I placed the folder on the table. "There's something you both need to see," I said quietly. Aaron leaned back, arms crossed, a smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. Mr. Morton opened the folder and began to read. His eyes moved quickly across the pages before he looked up, expression shifting. "Claire," he said slowly, "where did you find this?" "In the farmhouse," I replied. "Behind Dad's desk." Aaron's smirk faltered. "What is it?" he asked. Mr. Morton adjusted his glasses. "It appears your father maintained a private trust, one not listed in the initial estate. It includes investments, property deeds, and accounts totaling over $3 million. All of it belongs to Claire." The silence that followed was absolute. Aaron's jaw tightened. He turned toward me, voice rising. "You're lying. Dad wouldn't hide something like that from me." Mr. Morton spoke before I could. "He did, Aaron. The instructions were specific to disclose it only if Claire discovered it herself." Aaron slammed his hand on the table, the sound sharp against the wood. "He set me up," he snapped. I looked at him steady. "He tested us both," I said. "We just didn't realize it." Mr. Morton folded the papers carefully and placed them back in the folder. "Your father's wishes are clear," he said. "The trust belongs entirely to your sister." Aaron pushed his chair back and stood abruptly. "This isn't over," he muttered, heading for the door. The air shifted as he left, the echo of his footsteps fading down the hallway. Mr. Morton looked at me, his voice soft. "Your father would be proud, Claire. Not for what you found, but for how you handled it." I nodded, unsure what to say. As I stepped outside, the afternoon light hit my face. The brass key was still in my pocket, warm against my hand. For the first time since this began, I didn't feel small or forgotten. I felt steady. Back at the farmhouse, the air was calm, the rooms filled with the soft sound of wind through open windows. I set the folder on the table next to Dad's letter and exhaled slowly. Aaron's anger would come back around, I knew that. But right now, the only thing that mattered was the truth that had been waiting for me all along. And somewhere deep down, I could almost hear my father say, "Good work, kiddo." For days after the meeting, the house felt quieter than usual. Even the ticking clock in the hallway sounded softer, like it understood something had shifted. I'd thought learning the truth about the trust would bring peace, but instead, it left me restless. Every time I looked at my father's letter, I heard his voice in my mind, steady and sure. Use it wisely, quietly, and never let arrogance touch it. I understood the words, but I kept wondering what wisely meant to him. He'd built his life on order, on seeing possibilities others missed. Maybe he'd left me this to build something new, not just for me, but for the family name he'd spent decades shaping. Aaron didn't call for a week. When he finally did, his voice was sharp and impatient. "You really think this changes anything?" he said before I could even say hello. "You got lucky, Claire. That's all." I listened in silence until he said, "The company's going through a transition. I could still use your help. You've always been good at making things look pretty." His tone was clipped, not kind. I thanked him and hung up before I could say something I'd regret. That night, I sat at my father's desk, the same one where I'd found the hidden safe. The wood still smelled faintly of tobacco and varnish. I turned on the small lamp and began going through the papers again. Balance sheets, notes, property records, each one a piece of a puzzle he'd left behind. My father had always believed in structure, but there was something different about these records. They weren't just numbers. They were pieces of a life he'd prepared for me to uncover. I found one note in the margin of a document dated 5 years earlier. It read, "Trust grows quietly." He'd underlined it twice. I didn't know if he meant the financial kind or something else entirely. The next morning I called Ruth and asked if she could stop by. When she arrived, she looked at me with that knowing expression she always had. "I've been thinking about him," I said, sliding the note across the table. She read it slowly, then looked up. "Your father liked to speak in lessons," she said. "When he said something like that, he meant more than one thing. He wanted you to build your life the same way he built his, steady, not loud." Her words stayed with me. That afternoon, I walked through the farmhouse again, room by room, seeing it with new eyes. The cracked plaster, the uneven floors, the light coming through the dusty windows. It wasn't ruin anymore. It was potential. Maybe this was where I could begin. Over the next few weeks, I started small. I cleaned, repaired what I could, painted the walls a soft ivory that made the rooms glow in the morning sun. I found old blueprints my father had drawn, floor plans with tiny notes in the margins, measurements, cost estimates, sketches of built-in shelves and crown molding. I realized he'd planned to renovate, but never had the chance. Following his lines on the paper, I started to see the house differently, as if he'd left me instructions written in silence. Every project I completed gave me a sense of rhythm again. The house that once felt heavy began to breathe. Neighbors who hadn't spoken to the Whitmores in years started stopping by, curious about the changes. One afternoon, an older man named George Keller, who lived down the road, came by with a truckload of reclaimed wood. "Your dad helped me fix my porch years ago," he said. "Figured I'd return the favor." I accepted, and he helped me build new steps for the front porch. By the end of the day, my hands were blistered, but the front of the house looked alive again. As summer turned to fall, the place began to transform. I sold a few of my design sketches to a boutique downtown and used the money to hire local carpenters for the roof repairs. I didn't touch the trust money. My father's words about using it wisely echoed every time I thought about it. Instead, I used my own earnings, letting the work itself be the reward. Then one evening, a thick envelope arrived in the mail. It was from Aaron. Inside was a copy of a financial report from Whitmore Printing Solutions and a short note that read, "Hope you're enjoying Dad's little game. The company's bleeding. If you care about the family, you'll step in before it's too late." There was no greeting, no signature, just that. I sat with the letter for a long time, the paper shaking slightly between my fingers. I knew the business had been struggling for years. Dad had mentioned it before he got sick, how Aaron focused too much on expansion and not enough on sustainability. But the way Aaron worded his letter made something inside me tighten. It wasn't a plea. It was a warning. The next morning I drove to town and stopped outside the old Whitmore printing building. The sign was still there, though the paint had started to fade. Through the glass doors I could see the once busy lobby, now half empty, with boxes stacked against the walls. A receptionist I didn't recognize looked up as I stepped inside. "Can I help you?" she asked. I told her who I was, and after a short pause, she nodded. "Mr. Whitmore's in his office." Aaron's office looked like a showroom, leather furniture, glass-topped desk, framed awards from years past. He glanced up from his computer, irritation flashing across his face before he forced a smile. "Didn't expect you," he said. "Here to see the empire crumble." I ignored the jab and asked how things were going. He shrugged. "Business is business. Some clients pulled out, some suppliers backed off. It happens." His voice carried that same mix of pride and panic I'd heard so many times before. "Dad's systems were outdated," he added, leaning back. "I'm trying to modernize." "Modernizing doesn't mean hollowing it out," I said quietly. He froze, then looked at me with something between anger and disbelief. "You think you could run this place better?" he asked. "You design living rooms, Claire. This is real business." The words stung, but I didn't respond. Instead, I looked around his office again at the empty shelves, the dusty corners, the faded photo of Dad on the wall. For a moment, I saw not the arrogant man my brother had become, but the boy who once stood on this same floor holding a trophy, grinning for Dad's approval. I left without another word. Outside, the late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the parking lot. The air smelled faintly of ink and asphalt, a smell that had once defined my childhood. I stood there for a while, watching the reflection of the building in the car window, realizing how much of it was built on pride. That evening, back at the farmhouse, I sat on the porch with a cup of tea. The oak trees rustled softly in the wind. I thought about everything my father had taught us, Aaron, through Power Me, through patience. The difference had never been clearer. I reached for the brass key still on my chain and turned it over in my hand. The house was almost ready. The trust untouched, the lessons unfolding piece by piece. Maybe this was what my father meant by wisely. Building something lasting not through inheritance, but through endurance. The next morning, a call came from Mr. Morton. "Your brother's been asking questions," he said carefully, "about accessing parts of your father's estate that don't belong to him." His tone was calm but edged with warning. I thanked him, said I'd handle it, and hung up. I looked out the window at the sun rising over the fields. The farmhouse glowed pale gold, its roof newly fixed, the steps still smelling of fresh wood. For the first time, it didn't feel like a reminder of what I'd lost. It felt like a beginning. But deep down, I knew Aaron wasn't finished. And the next time he reached out, it wouldn't be for help. It would be to take back what he thought was his. A week passed before I heard from Aaron again. His number flashed on my phone late one evening while I was patching a corner of drywall in the hallway. For a moment, I considered letting it ring, but something told me to answer. His voice was tight, stripped of its usual confidence. "We need to talk," he said, face to face. I agreed to meet him at Mr. Morton's office the next afternoon, though I didn't ask why. The air was cool when I pulled into the downtown parking lot. The same oak trees lined the sidewalk, their leaves just starting to turn. When I stepped inside the office, Aaron was already there, pacing near the window. His tie was loose, his eyes shadowed. "Thanks for coming," he said, but the words felt forced. Mr. Morton gestured for us both to sit. "Your father's trust created a few responsibilities we haven't fully discussed," he began. Aaron leaned forward. "I already know the responsibilities," he cut in. "I'm the one holding a sinking company together." Mr. Morton's tone remained calm. "The trust has nothing to do with the company, Aaron. Your father left separate instructions regarding those assets." He glanced at me, then back at Aaron. "He asked that both of you be present for what comes next." From his briefcase, he pulled out a sealed envelope marked in our father's handwriting. For a moment, the room went completely still. Mr. Morton unfolded the letter and began to read. "To my children," it began, "Aaron, leadership is not control, it's responsibility. I gave you the company because I wanted you to build, not boast. Claire, you understood value without ever chasing it. You saw what others overlooked. That is why the future belongs to you." The last sentence hung in the air like a held breath. Aaron's face went pale. "That's not real," he said, his voice cracking. He wouldn't have written that. But Mr. Morton handed him the page. The handwriting was unmistakable. "He did," I said quietly. "He left it for both of us." Aaron stared at the letter for a long moment, then slammed it down on the table. "You think this makes you better than me? You got lucky, Claire. Dad gave you a safety net. I've been running this company with nothing but pressure and debt." His words tumbled out fast, almost desperate. I didn't answer. There was nothing I could say that wouldn't sound like victory, and that wasn't what this was. Mr. Morton cleared his throat. "Your father also specified that the trust and its assets are entirely separate from the business. They cannot be merged or leveraged. They belong to Claire alone." Aaron's expression hardened. "He left me a dying company and gave her millions. That's not balance, that's betrayal." I stood gathering the papers into a neat stack. "Dad trusted you to build something," I said softly. "He trusted me to understand why." Aaron scoffed, pushing back from the table so hard the chair scraped the floor. "You always had an answer ready, didn't you?" "The quiet one who thinks she knows better." His voice was rising now, the edge of anger bleeding through. Mr. Morton stood as well. "That's enough," he said firmly. "This conversation is over." Aaron stormed out the door, slamming behind him. The sound echoed down the hall. For a moment, neither of us moved. Then Mr. Morton exhaled slowly. "He'll need time," he said, "but your father's wishes are clear." I nodded, slipping the brass key back into my pocket. It felt heavier now than it had that first day. When I returned to the farmhouse, the sky was already dark. The porch light flickered as I unlocked the door. Inside, the room smelled faintly of sawdust and fresh paint. The house had begun to take shape again, every wall and window slowly coming back to life. I walked through the hallway, my footsteps quiet against the floorboards. In the study, I placed the letter from Dad beside the others in the top drawer. The words on the page seemed to glow under the lamp. "The future belongs to you." That night, sleep didn't come easily. I kept hearing Aaron's voice replaying every word. I'd always known he struggled with pride, but something in his tone that day was different, strained, almost afraid. I thought about calling him, then decided against it. Whatever lesson Dad meant for us to learn, Aaron hadn't learned his yet. Days turned into weeks. The farmhouse continued to change. I refinished the floors, hung new curtains, and started sketching design ideas at the kitchen table. My old clients had begun calling again, asking if I was taking new projects. It felt good to say yes. By early winter, I had more work than I could handle, so I hired George Keller to help build furniture for a few of my commissions. His craftsmanship reminded me of my father's, precise, patient, honest. One afternoon, while we were sanding a set of oak shelves, my phone buzzed. Aaron's name lit up the screen. I hesitated before answering. His voice was quieter this time, but strained. "Claire," he said, "I need help." I set down the sander and stepped outside onto the porch. "What's going on?" I asked. He sighed, the sound rough and uneven. "The company's in trouble. Payroll bounced, and I've lost 2 of our biggest contracts. I just need a small loan enough to keep things afloat." I looked out over the fields. The trees were bare now, their branches swaying in the wind. "Dad gave you a company worth millions," I said carefully. "You can fix it, Aaron. You've always been the ambitious one." "It's not that simple," he said quickly. "Everything's collapsing. Investors are pulling out. I just need time." His voice cracked slightly on the last word. "I can't," I said finally. "You have to do this yourself." There was a long silence before he spoke again, this time sharper. "You think you're better than me because you got Dad's secret fortune? You think that makes you smarter?" "No," I said quietly. "I just learned from him. You didn't." He hung up without another word. The sound of the dial tone filled the air for a moment before fading. I stood there in the cold, my breath visible in the twilight, the weight of his anger lingering like frost. That night I opened my father's final letter again. The paper was worn now, edges soft, from being folded and unfolded. His handwriting looked steady, untouched by doubt. "You were my balance," it said. I traced the words with my fingertip, realizing they meant more than fairness. He'd seen what each of us would become. Over the next few months, word about Aaron's business began to spread through town. Old colleagues whispered that the company was collapsing contracts, unfulfilled clients unpaid. Some said he'd tried to sell part of the business, but no one was buying. Every rumor carried the same thread arrogance and overreach, the same traits Dad had warned him about. Meanwhile, life at the farmhouse continued to unfold quietly. My small design business grew faster than I expected. I registered it under a new name, Oak Street Studio, after the road that led to our property. Clients came from nearby towns, drawn to the simplicity of my work. It wasn't wealth or status, but it was honest success. One evening, as I locked up for the night, I caught a glimpse of my reflection in the study window. The woman staring back didn't look like someone who had been overlooked. The farmhouse that once felt like a burden now felt like proof, a reminder that patience could outlast pride. Before turning off the light, I placed the brass key on the desk beside Dad's letter. The wind outside carried a low hum through the trees, soft and steady, like a voice I'd almost forgotten. Aaron hadn't called again, but I knew the silence wouldn't last. He was my brother, and pride never stayed quiet for long. A month passed before Aaron's silence finally broke. The call came late on a Tuesday, just as I was closing up the studio. The light from the setting sun spilled through the windows, turning the tools and sketches on my desk a deep amber. When I answered, his voice sounded different, thinner, cracked around the edges. "Claire," he said, "it's bad. I don't know what to do." I didn't respond right away. He took my pause as permission to continue. "Payroll didn't clear again. The vendors are threatening to pull their contracts. I just need something to keep us running." I could hear the rustle of papers in the background, the faint hum of an office that once thrived. "You have the trust," he said. "You can loan me something. I'll pay it back." I took a breath and leaned against the window. "Dad gave you everything you needed to make that business work," I said quietly. "You had the tools. You just didn't listen." He sighed sharply, the sound full of exhaustion and disbelief. "I'm not asking for a lecture, Claire. I'm asking for help." The silence stretched between us. I wanted to soften, to reach out the way I always had when we were younger, but something inside me stayed firm. "Aaron," I said, "you're going to have to fix this yourself." There was a long pause before he answered. "You've always thought you were better than me," he muttered. "You think Dad chose you because you're smarter?" His voice cracked on the last word, then went flat. "You're just lucky, that's all." The line went dead. I stood there for a long time, staring out at the fading light. The fields around the farmhouse glowed gold, then slowly dimmed to gray. I wanted to feel angry, but all I felt was tired, tired of being compared, tired of carrying the weight of a family built on pride. The next few weeks brought winter. The mornings were cold, the kind that made the air taste sharp. Work at the studio kept me busy, but Aaron lingered in the back of my mind. I heard bits and pieces from neighbors and old family friends, whispers about layoffs, unpaid suppliers, even rumors that the building itself might go up for sale. One afternoon, Ruth stopped by with a thermos of soup and that quiet steadiness she always carried. "He called me," she said softly as we sat at the kitchen table. "Sounded lost." She looked at me, her eyes kind. "You can't save him, Claire. You've done enough." I nodded, though I wasn't sure if I believed it. A week later, a letter arrived in the mail. The envelope was thin, the handwriting messy but familiar. Inside was a single sheet of paper, Aaron's. "I can't hold it together anymore. The bank's freezing the accounts. If you don't help me, everything Dad built will be gone." There was no signature, just his initials at the bottom, shaky and uneven. I folded the letter and set it aside. That night I pulled out Dad's file again, the trust papers, the investment notes, the letters he'd written to me. His words about balance echoed in my head. Leadership isn't control, it's responsibility. He hadn't meant for either of us to win or lose. He'd meant for us to learn. The next morning I called Mr. Morton. "Aaron's in trouble," I said. His sigh came through the line like a heavy wind. "I've heard," he said. "He's already defaulted on a few contracts. I wish I could tell you it was fixable." I asked if there was anything left to do. "There's always something left to learn," he said quietly. 2 days later, Aaron showed up at the farmhouse. It was the first time I'd seen him since that meeting in Mr. Morton's office. He looked older, his suit wrinkled, his eyes hollow. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then he said, "You really aren't going to help me, are you?" I motioned for him to come inside. The house was warm from the wood stove, the smell of cedar filling the air. He didn't sit down. "You could save me with one check," he said. "You have the money. Dad made sure of that." His words trembled between anger and pleading. "I could," I said softly, "but I won't. That's not what he wanted for us." He laughed bitterly. "He wanted you to punish me." "Admit it." I shook my head. "He wanted you to learn what he already knew, that pride can't carry a legacy." His shoulders slumped. For a moment I thought he might apologize. Instead he whispered, "You sound just like him." Then he turned and walked out. The door closed gently behind him. Not a slam this time, just quiet defeat. The sound of his car faded down the gravel road, leaving only the wind and the creak of the porch steps. I stood there for a long time watching the empty driveway. There was a strange kind of peace in it, not satisfaction, just understanding. Over the next month, news spread that Whitmore Printing had gone under. The papers said economic downturn, but I knew the truth. Aaron's company hadn't collapsed from bad luck. It had collapsed from the weight of his own choices. One evening, while I was sorting through design orders in the study, the phone rang again. For a moment I thought it might be another client, but when I picked up, I heard his voice quieter now, almost small. "It's over," he said. "The company's gone." I waited, unsure what to say. I lost the building, the clients, everything. I thought I could handle it, Claire. I really did. The words hung there between us, fragile and honest. I could hear the sound of wind through his car window, the faint hum of traffic behind him. "I don't know what to do now," he said. "Start over," I said softly. "Like Dad did. Build something smaller, something that lasts." He didn't respond right away. When he finally spoke, his voice was raw. "You really believe I can?" "I think you have to," I said. There was a quiet laugh, tired, broken, but real. "You always were the patient one," he said. Then the line went silent. After I hung up, I walked out to the porch. The night was cold, the stars faint behind a thin layer of clouds. I thought of Dad standing here years ago watching those same trees sway in the wind. He used to say that patience was the truest kind of strength. Now I finally understood what he meant. Inside the farmhouse was warm and bright. The floors no longer creaked, the walls gleamed with new paint. The place Aaron once called a dump had become a home, a reflection of everything I'd rebuilt piece by piece. I poured a cup of tea and sat by the window, the brass key resting in my palm. The sound of the wind outside was steady, almost like a heartbeat. Somewhere out there, Aaron was facing what I'd already learned, that sometimes losing everything isn't the end. It's the start of something different. And though I didn't know what tomorrow would bring, I knew this much: my father had been right all along. We both needed to be tested. We both needed to break before we could understand what it meant to build. As the first light of morning touched the fields, I whispered a quiet, "Thank you, not for the money or even the house, but for the lesson that had finally come full circle." Spring returned quietly that year, the kind that painted the hills in soft greens and golds. The air around the farmhouse smelled of cut grass and new wood, a mix of work and peace. My small design firm had grown faster than I expected, and by early April, Oak Street Studio was officially registered. Clients came from nearby towns, drawn by word of mouth, and the kind of work that wasn't just decoration, it was restoration. Every project reminded me of my father's words: "Precision is respect." Most mornings began the same way. I'd wake before sunrise, make coffee in the old percolator, and sit on the porch steps with my sketchbook. The light would spill across the yard, catching the fresh paint on the porch railings and the glass panes I'd finally replaced. What used to feel like a burden had become a symbol of something steadier, proof that rebuilding could be its own kind of grace. I hadn't heard from Aaron in months. The last I knew, he'd sold the remains of the printing company and moved to Charlotte for a new job in sales. When his name appeared on my phone one evening, I hesitated before answering. His voice was flat, strained. "Claire, I need to see you," he said. "It won't take long." There was no hint of the old arrogance, only fatigue. Against my better judgment, I told him to come by the next afternoon. He arrived in a small gray sedan, not the luxury car he used to drive. His clothes looked wrinkled, and there were shadows under his eyes that hadn't been there before. When he stepped onto the porch, he paused, taking in the house. "You fixed it," he said quietly. His tone wasn't mocking, just surprised. "I did," I said, motioning for him to come inside. He followed me to the kitchen, his footsteps cautious on the newly polished floors. I poured him coffee the same way Dad used to, and waited for him to speak. I lost everything, he said finally. The company, the cars, the condo. I tried to save it, but every time I thought I had control, something else fell apart. He looked down at his hands, the knuckles reddened. I thought I could do it alone. I listened without interrupting. He wasn't asking for pity, just release. "Dad warned me," he said after a while. "He told me leadership wasn't about power." I didn't believe him. His voice cracked on the last word. "Now I get it, but it's too late." "It's not too late," I said gently. "You're still here." He gave a faint smile, one that didn't quite reach his eyes. "You sound like Mom," he murmured. Then he looked around the kitchen again, taking in the fresh paint, the framed sketches, the smell of coffee. "I used to think this house was a curse," he said. "Now I think it's the only thing he left that really mattered." We sat there for a while, not as rivals, but as what we should have been all along. Two people shaped by the same man, learning at different speeds. When he stood to leave, he reached into his pocket and handed me a small envelope. Inside was an old photograph of the three of us, Dad, Aaron, and me, standing by the oak trees when we were kids. The edges were worn, the colors fading, but our faces still held that simple brightness from before everything got complicated. "Keep it," he said. "I don't need reminders right now." Then he nodded once, turned, and walked to his car. I stood on the porch until his taillights disappeared down the gravel road. That evening I sat at my father's desk, the photograph propped beside his old letter. The two pieces of paper, one fragile, one firm, felt like the beginning and end of the same story. I traced the words of the letter again, remembering the line that had changed everything. "You were my balance." For the first time, I understood what he meant. It wasn't about fairness or inheritance. It was about equilibrium, how every family needs both strength and stillness to stay standing. Weeks passed, and the studio grew busier. George helped me finish the last of the renovations, replacing the barn doors with wide glass panels that filled the room with light. Clients came by appointment, often staying longer than planned just to talk. Some said the space felt peaceful, and I liked hearing that. It meant I'd built something that carried the calm my father once tried to live by. Every now and then I'd hear updates about Aaron through mutual acquaintances. He'd found steady work in Charlotte, living in a modest apartment near the city center. The arrogance that once defined him had quieted. There was no mention of new ventures, no headlines about business deals, just a man learning piece by piece to live differently. One afternoon, Ruth stopped by with a basket of fresh bread. "You've done something beautiful here," she said, looking around. "He'd be proud." I smiled, setting the bread on the counter. Maybe he already knows. After she left, I stepped outside. The air was cool, the sky streaked with orange and violet. The oak trees Dad had planted decades ago stood tall and full, their branches whispering in the breeze. I sat on the porch steps, the same spot where I used to sit as a child, listening to him tell stories about his time in the service. He'd always end with the same line, "Precision is respect, Claire. Do things with care, and they'll last." As dusk deepened, I thought about the long road from that will reading to this quiet moment. The laughter that once stung the farmhouse, that once felt like a burden, it had all led here. Justice hadn't come through revenge or wealth. It had come through patience, through the slow rebuilding of a life that no one thought had value. Later that night I called Aaron. He answered on the second ring. "Hey," he said, his voice softer than I'd ever heard it. "Hey," I replied. "How's work different?" he said after a pause. "But better." We talked for a few minutes, small things, mostly weather, family, old memories. When we hung up, there was a calm I hadn't felt in years. Not forgiveness exactly, but something close. I stood at the window looking out over the fields. The farmhouse glowed under the porch light, the oak trees casting long shadows across the grass. My father's lessons had reached both of us, just on different timelines. Tomorrow there would be new clients, new projects, new plans. But tonight, all I felt was stillness, the quiet kind that follows understanding. The brass key rested on the desk beside me, catching the faint light from the lamp. It no longer felt like a burden or a mystery. It felt like an answer. Outside, the wind moved through the trees, soft and steady, carrying the sound of balance restored. The years that followed moved slower, like time had finally stopped rushing past me. The farmhouse stood steady on its foundation, its white paint glowing soft in the morning sun. From the porch, I could see the oak trees my father planted decades ago, tall, full, unshaken by the seasons. The studio had grown beyond what I ever imagined. Oak Street Studio wasn't just a business anymore. It was a place where people came to feel grounded again. Clients brought stories, sometimes broken ones, and I helped them find beauty in rebuilding. Every corner of that farmhouse carried pieces of our family's history, the good, the painful, the lessons we learned too late. The study where I once found the hidden safe had become my design room, the heart of everything I created. I kept my father's letter framed on the wall above the desk, not as a reminder of what I gained, but of what I learned. His words still guided me each day. Use it wisely, quietly, and never let arrogance touch it. Aaron and I spoke more often now. Our calls were shorter but honest. He'd found a job at a small printing company in Charlotte, nothing glamorous but steady. "I actually like it," he told me one night. "There's no boardroom, no pressure to impress anyone, just work that feels real." His voice carried a quiet humility I'd never heard before. I didn't say much, just listened because for once he didn't need advice. He was finding his way. Sometimes I'd catch myself thinking about the day of the will, reading the humiliation, the sting of his laughter, the heavy silence that followed. But those memories didn't hurt anymore. They felt distant, like echoes from another life. Back then, I thought justice would come from proving everyone wrong. But standing here now, watching the light filter through the oak leaves, I realized justice had come in a much gentler way. It wasn't about revenge or even fairness. It was about balance. One afternoon, while sorting through old family boxes, I found a small wooden crate tucked behind a shelf in the attic. Inside was a bundle of letters wrapped with twine yellowed with age. Most were from my mother, short notes she'd written to my father before they married. In one she'd written, "I hope our children learn to see the world the way you do, to believe that quiet strength lasts longer than noise." Reading her words, I felt something ease inside me. Maybe that was what both of them had wanted all along, for Aaron and me to understand the value of quiet strength. That night I sat on the porch with a cup of coffee the same way my father used to. The field stretched out in every direction, calm and endless. The air was cool, carrying the faint scent of rain. I thought about how much life had changed since the day I drove back here, holding that brass key, feeling like I'd been left behind. I smiled, realizing how wrong I'd been. My father hadn't left me behind, he'd sent me home. The farmhouse had become something more than a symbol of inheritance. It was a place of restoration, not just for me, but for everyone who stepped through its doors. People often asked if I ever planned to move or sell, but I couldn't imagine living anywhere else. This house was the truest part of who I'd become. Every beam and window carried a story, every wall held a lesson. Sometimes I still opened the old metal box from the bank. The papers inside had started to yellow, and the ink was fading, but the message was still clear. You were my balance. Those 4 words had carried me through everything. They reminded me that being underestimated wasn't a weakness, it was an advantage. The world expects noise, but sometimes the strongest thing you can do is stay steady. On quiet mornings, I'd see Aaron's name flash on my phone, and I always answered. Our conversations had changed. He asked about my projects, told me about his coworkers, even mentioned taking classes in business ethics. There was no rivalry now, no old bitterness, just 2 siblings learning finally how to stand side by side. The last time we talked, he said I used to think Dad gave me the company because he trusted me more. Now I think he gave it to me so I'd learn what trust really costs. His voice was calm, not bitter. You figured it out first, he added. I'm just catching up. When we hung up, I sat by the window watching the sky turn gold. The light hit the brass key on my desk, and for a moment it glimmered just like it had that first day in the lawyer's office. Only now it didn't feel like a burden. It felt like gratitude. I don't think my father ever meant to test us in a cruel way. He just wanted us to find our true worth, to learn the kind of strength that lasts beyond money or success. And in the end, we both did. He'd given Aaron a company to run and me a house to rebuild, and somehow both of those things brought us to the same understanding that respect isn't earned by what we inherit, but by what we create from it. The farmhouse still creaks in the winter wind, and the oak trees still hum in the summer heat. I like to think those sounds are their way of talking my father and mother, reminding me that love doesn't always arrive in grand gestures. Sometimes it's a hidden note in a wall, a key left behind, or a lesson that waits for years to be understood. If you've ever been the quiet one, the one people overlooked while others took the credit, you know what it feels like to build your piece from the pieces left behind. And maybe like me, you've learned that being underestimated can be the most powerful gift of all. So wherever you are tonight, take a deep breath, hold on to your patience, and trust that balance always finds its way back. And if this story spoke to you, share it with someone who might need the reminder that quiet strength never goes unnoticed forever.